I do not remember the moment I was born, but everything about my life tells me how it must have been. I came into this world inside a small wooden hut, built quickly and poorly, with walls that let the wind pass through as if they were never meant to protect anyone. The floor was dirt, cold, and damp, and the air smelled of smoke, sweat, and fear. There was no doctor waiting for me, no clean sheets, no certainty that I would survive even a single night. My mother gave birth surrounded by women from the village, all of them exhausted, all of them silent except for whispered prayers. They had seen this too many times before. Some children lived, many did not. Death was not a tragedy here, it was an expectation. When a child died, people lowered their heads for a moment and then returned to their work, because stopping meant hunger. I was told later that I cried loudly when I was born. That cry meant I was alive. That was enough to call it a success. The first years of my life were fragile. Illness was common, and food was never guaranteed. My body was small, weak, and often sick. My mother held me close during the cold nights, not out of comfort, but because warmth could mean the difference between life and death. Winter was always waiting, and everyone knew it. As I grew older, I began to understand the world around me, though no one ever explained it. I learned by watching. I watched my parents leave before sunrise and return long after dark. I watched their hands crack and bleed, their backs bend lower every year. I watched them count pieces of bread carefully, knowing exactly how many mouths they had to feed and how little they had to give. The land around us was vast, but none of it belonged to us. Every field, every tree, every path was owned by the Lord. We were allowed to work the soil, but never to claim it. Even as a child, I understood that my life was already decided. I would work, just as my parents did. I would obey, just as they did. There was no other path. By the time I could walk without falling, I was already useful. I carried small buckets of water from the well, struggling with their weight. I gathered sticks from the forest floor, careful not to take too much, because punishment followed those who broke the rules. I fed animals that were treated with more care than people, because animals produced value, while people simply consumed it. No one called this cruelty. It was normal. Children who did not learn to work early often did not survive long enough to grow old. At night, I lay awake listening to the sounds outside the hut, wind pressing against the walls, animals moving in the darkness, the distant voices of other peasants, just as tired and afraid as we were. My parents whispered about the coming winter, about taxes owed, about whether the harvest would be enough. Fear was always present, even when nothing bad was happening yet. I did not dream of becoming anything else. I did not imagine a different life. The world was small, and I belonged entirely to it. As the years passed, my body grew stronger, but my life did not grow easier. By the time I was old enough to understand words clearly, I had already learned the most important lesson of our world. Hunger never leaves. Some days it slept quietly, almost forgotten, but it was always there, waiting to return. When food was scarce, it became the only thing anyone could think about. I remember mornings when my stomach hurt so badly that it felt like something inside me was tearing itself apart. We ate slowly, carefully, breaking bread into small pieces to make it last. My parents pretended not to be hungry so that I could eat a little more. I understood this even as a child, and the knowledge stayed with me. Guilt became as familiar as hunger itself. Work filled my days completely. I followed my parents into the fields, my small hands trying to imitate their movements. I pulled weeds, carried tools, and learned how to stay silent. Silence was important. Speaking too much, asking questions, or complaining only brought trouble. The fields were wide and open, but my world felt narrow and closed, shaped by rules I had never agreed to. The seasons ruled everything. Spring brought hope, summer brought exhaustion, autumn brought fear, and winter brought suffering. We lived from harvest to harvest, knowing that a single storm or a few weeks without rain could destroy everything. When crops failed, there were no second chances. There was only hunger and then death. It was during one of these hard seasons that I saw death closely for the first time. A boy from our village, only a few years older than me, fell ill. His skin burned with fever, and his breathing became shallow and weak. His family did not know what to do. No one did. We had no medicine, no knowledge, and no time. After a few days, he stopped breathing. I remember standing outside the hut while his body was carried out. It was light, too light, as if hunger had already begun to erase him before death finished the work. His mother cried openly, her voice breaking the quiet of the village, but no one told her to stop. Everyone understood her pain, even if they could not afford to share it for long. The next day, the fields waited, just as they always did. From that moment, death stopped being a distant idea. It became something real, something close enough to touch. I understood that life here was fragile, and that survival depended on more than hard work. It depended on luck, timing, and obedience. As I grew older, my tasks became heavier. I carried larger loads, worked longer hours, and learned how to hide my exhaustion. My hands grew rough, covered in cuts and blisters that never fully healed. Pain was no longer something I reacted to. It was simply part of my body. At night, I lay awake thinking about the future, not in terms of dreams, but in terms of survival. I wondered whether I would live through the next winter, whether my family would have enough food, and whether the Lord's men would come demanding more than we could give. Fear settled into me quietly, becoming part of who I was. I was still a child, but childhood no longer belonged to me. As I grew older, I began to understand something that had always been there, but had never been spoken aloud. Our suffering was not accidental. It was organized. It had a shape, a structure, and a name. The Lord. We rarely saw him, but his presence ruled every part of our lives. His land stretched farther than my eyes could see, and everything that grew on it already belonged to him before it was harvested. We worked not to improve our lives, but to maintain his power. Even as a child, I learned to lower my head whenever his name was spoken. Once a year, his men arrived in the village. We always knew when they were coming. Fear moved faster than horses. People whispered, counted sacks of grain again and again, and argued late into the night. No matter how much we prepared, it was never enough. When the Lord's men arrived, they did not shout. They did not need to. They walked calmly through the village, reading names from lists, measuring grain, inspecting animals. Their quiet confidence was worse than anger. It meant they expected obedience, and they always received it. My father stood stiff beside our small pile of grain, his hands clenched tightly at his sides. I watched as the men took most of what we had grown with our own labor. They did not ask how much we needed to survive. They only cared about how much was owed. When some families could not pay, punishment followed quickly. A man was beaten in front of everyone, not because he was dangerous, but because he was an example. A family lost their animals and had nothing left to plow their fields. Fear spread through the village like disease, silent but powerful. That day I learned something important. Justice did not exist to protect us. It existed to remind us of our place. After the collectors left, the village felt emptier. Not just because of the grain that was gone, but because hope left with it. People moved slower, spoke less, and looked older. Hunger came sooner that year, and it stayed longer. My work increased as my body grew stronger. I labored from morning until night, my muscles burning and my hands numb. Rest was brief and uncomfortable. Even when I slept, my body felt tense, as if it expected pain at any moment. I learned how to ignore discomfort, how to keep moving even when everything inside me begged to stop. Fear became constant. Fear of hunger, fear of punishment, fear of winter, fear that one mistake could destroy everything my family had left. It was not loud fear. It did not make me run or scream. It settled quietly in my chest and stayed there. I stopped thinking of myself as a child. I stopped expecting kindness from the world. Survival required obedience, silence, and endurance. Anything else was dangerous. I did not know it then, but this fear would follow me for the rest of my life. Winter arrived earlier than we expected that year. The air grew sharp and heavy, and the ground hardened beneath our feet long before we were ready. We tried to prepare, but preparation was always limited by what little we had. Firewood disappeared quickly, and food had to be measured with painful care. Every meal felt like a decision that could cost us later. The cold crept into everything. It slipped through the walls of our hut, settled into our clothes, and sank deep into our bones. At night, we slept close together, sharing what little warmth our bodies could produce. Even then, I woke up shivering, my breath visible in the darkness. Hunger returned stronger than before. The bread became thinner, and sometimes there was nothing at all. We drank water to fill our stomachs, knowing it would not last. My body felt weaker each day, my movements slower. Work did not stop because of the cold. The fields still demanded attention, and the animals still needed care. It was during this winter that illness spread through the village. It started quietly with coughs and fevers, and then grew worse. People collapsed while working. Children cried through the night, their bodies burning with heat even as the air around them froze. No one understood why it was happening. There were no cures, only waiting. My father fell sick first. At first, he tried to hide it, forcing himself to work despite the shaking in his hands and the fever in his eyes. Rest was a luxury we could not afford. But one morning he could no longer stand. His breathing became shallow and his skin felt hot to the touch. We waited. That was all we could do. Days passed and his condition worsened. My mother stayed beside him when she could, but work still demanded her presence. I watched him grow weaker, his voice fading, his eyes losing focus. I had never seen him afraid before. Seeing it now made my chest tighten in a way I did not understand. One night he stopped breathing. There was no dramatic moment, no final words. He simply became still. My mother cried silently, pressing her forehead against his chest, as if refusing to believe what had happened. I stood nearby, unable to move, unable to understand how the world could continue after something so important had ended. The next day, the fields waited. We buried him when the ground allowed it, using tools that barely broke the frozen soil. There was no ceremony, only quiet faces and tired hands. When it was over, we returned home, and life continued, as it always did. Loss did not change our obligations. Hunger did not wait for grief to pass. Winter did not care who had died. I grew older that winter, not in years, but in understanding. I learned that survival required sacrifice, and that pain was not an exception, but the rule. The world did not pause for loss, and neither could I. War came when I was already tired of living, though I was not yet old. It did not arrive with songs or banners, and no one asked whether we were ready. One day, soldiers appeared on the road near our village, their armor dirty, their faces hard and hungry. They did not look like heroes. They looked like men who had been walking toward death for too long. They took what little food we had left. They took animals that were meant to help us survive the next winter. Some huts were burned, not out of anger, but simply because the soldiers needed warmth. We watched from a distance, silent, knowing that resistance would only make things worse. Then they began to take men. I did not volunteer, none of us did, but refusal was not an option. A blade at your throat leaves little room for choice. I was handed a weapon that felt unfamiliar and heavy in my hands. There was no training, no armor worth trusting, only fear, thick and heavy in my chest. I marched with other peasants who looked just like me. Thin, tired, already broken by life before the war even began. We did not talk much. There was nothing left to say. Each step felt like moving farther away from everything I had ever known, even though I had never known much. The battlefield was chaos, noise, smoke, screaming, and confusion. I could not see clearly, and I could not think. I moved forward because the men behind me pushed, and the men in front of me fell. I swung my weapon without understanding who I was aiming at. There was no hatred in me, only terror. I felt pain suddenly, sharp and burning. At first, I did not understand what had happened. My legs grew weak, and I fell into the mud, surrounded by bodies. The world around me continued to move, but I no longer could. As I lay there staring at the gray sky, I felt something strange. Not fear, not anger, relief. My life had been hunger, cold, work, and loss. I had labored since childhood and owned nothing. I had obeyed every rule, paid every tax, and endured every winter. There were no rewards waiting for me, no peace promised at the end. My breathing slowed. The sounds of battle faded into a distant echo. I thought of my mother, of the fields, of the hut where I had been born. I wondered briefly whether my death would change anything. It would not. Another peasant would take my place. The land would remain. The Lord would remain. The war would continue, and I would disappear just as quietly as I had lived.